Are you ready to witness an outrageous suburban showdown like nothing you've heard before? Buckle up for an engrossing tale of community drama, unexpected alliances, and the unstoppable power of a loyal service dog. Get comfortable, settle in, and let's dive into the saga of petty rules, hidden fears, and quiet acts of courage. If you want to find out how determined one homeowner can be, and what can possibly stop her, keep reading. Elaine Schubert looked up from her bird feeder, just in time to see a moving truck rumble past. The truck came to a stop in front of the vacant ranch-style house across the street. After 3 months on the market, 22 Pinevale Lane was finally getting a new resident. Elaine was pushing 70, long retired, and had seen neighbors come and go many times. But she couldn't recall any arrival that felt more curious. Perhaps it was the bright "Service Dog on Board" decal on the back of the sedan behind the moving truck that caught her eye. Perhaps it was simply that new arrivals in this neighborhood always sparked more gossip than genuine welcomes. She watched intently as a tall, lanky man stepped out of the sedan. He was maybe mid-30s, wearing a faded baseball cap with a cane in one hand. Then a medium-sized golden retriever hopped out after him, wearing a harness clearly labeled "Service Dog." Elaine felt a rush of sympathy. Though her own joints ached and slowed her down, she knew others faced far deeper challenges. She wondered what brought him here, and what sort of storms that dog might stir up. Why storms? Because this particular neighborhood association had a self-appointed enforcer, Karen Monroe, the local HOA president who lived 2 houses down. Folks often whispered the word Karen with rolled eyes, but no one dared openly defy her. She had once fined a neighbor for painting their shutters an unapproved shade of navy blue, pounded on another's door at 6 a.m. because their recycling bin had been placed out too early, and generally turned mild guidelines into ironclad laws. She thrived on the power, thrived on order. And so it was that Elaine found her curiosity tinged with dread. She could picture Karen scrutinizing every detail of the new neighbor's arrival, from the color of his curtains to the presence of a dog, service animal or not. In the Pinevale HOA, dogs were required to be under 40 pounds, always on a short leash, and absolutely silent. The golden retriever looked to Elaine as though it was easily 60 pounds. She knew Karen would latch onto any opportunity to cause trouble. While the movers hauled in boxes, Elaine decided to do the neighborly thing. She ambled across the street, the sunshine warming her shoulders. Drawing near, she saw the man carefully guiding the dog inside, occasionally pausing to stroke its fur. As Elaine approached, she could see a faint limp in the man's gait. "Hi there," Elaine called, offering a wave. "I'm Elaine from across the way. Welcome to the neighborhood." "Hello?" he replied, a little startled, but quick to return her polite smile. "I'm Colin. This is Trixie, my service dog." Trixie looked at Elaine with soft brown eyes, as if ready to become friends. Elaine noticed the harness on Trixie included a small patch reading "PTSD Service Dog." Suddenly everything clicked. Colin might be a veteran or someone dealing with trauma. She felt a surge of empathy. "I just wanted to say if you need help finding anything, shops, decent takeout places, let me know," she said warmly. "You picked a nice quiet area, though we do have a very active HOA." Her warning came out with forced cheer. "Yes," Colin said, glancing at the well-manicured lawns. "I'm aware. My realtor told me about the homeowner association's strictness." Elaine returned home, watching over her shoulder as Colin gently directed Trixie inside. A flicker of movement at the corner of her vision made her heart sink. Standing across the way on her own perfectly trimmed lawn was Karen Monroe, arms folded across her chest, eyes narrowed. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But she stood there studying the new neighbor. The next morning, Elaine noticed a bright yellow flyer taped to Colin's front door. She could only imagine what it read, some official-sounding notice from the HOA. Sure enough, the rumor mill started churning that same day. According to Carol, at the corner lot, Karen had expressed concerns about large breed dogs in the neighborhood. Word was she was looking into the matter. Elaine sighed. Here we go. She only hoped that maybe, just maybe, Karen would back down, once she realized Trixie was a legitimate service dog. But she knew better. Karen rarely let facts stand in her way. Little did anyone suspect how far Karen would go to enforce her vision of a perfect neighborhood, or the secrets that would be revealed in the process. The next few weeks settled into a routine for Colin. He'd walk Trixie around the block every morning, sometimes pausing to chat briefly with whichever neighbor was cordial enough to say hello. He'd do some yard work in the afternoons, occasionally leaning on his cane, Trixie at his side. To Elaine's eye, Colin was conscientious. Trixie was always leashed, never barked at passing dogs, and rarely showed any sign of mischief. However, Karen lurked. She would appear from behind her hydrangeas, arms folded, eyebrows knitted. She'd hover near Colin's driveway under the guise of pruning her shrubs. Neighbors joked that Karen had a mental schedule of every last dog walk and trash can placement in Pinevale. Yet, for a while, nothing big happened. Just an uneasy tension that soon reached the entire block. Then the letters started. Colin received a series of HOA compliance reminders about Trixie's size. They were polite at first, requesting updated registration records, copies of Trixie's service dog certification. Elaine felt a twinge of relief. Maybe once Colin provided the paperwork, Karen would relent. But apparently, Karen wasn't impressed. She latched onto small technicalities, like the standard therapy dog ID number not matching some obscure county pet ordinance. She demanded additional forms from Colin's doctor. She wanted him to detail the tasks Trixie performed. One sunny Saturday, Karen pounced on a new angle. Elaine was in her rose garden when she heard Karen's voice ring out in that shrill, self-assured tone. "Excuse me, that dog is off the sidewalk." Elaine turned to see Colin and Trixie on a patch of community-owned grass near the mailbox. "He's allowed to be here," Colin replied calmly, patting Trixie's harness. "I'm picking up my mail." Karen's face reddened as though she'd stumbled onto the perfect chance to scold him. "There's a designated dog path on the other side of the block for walking animals. This is common property. It's explicitly stated in Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the HOA guidelines." "It's 20 feet away from my mailbox," Colin said, exasperated. "Trixie hasn't done anything wrong. She's just—" "It doesn't matter," Karen snapped. "Rules are rules." Elaine found herself stepping forward. "Karen, honestly, that's not how the guidelines work. He's retrieving his mail, not taking Trixie for a joyride across the grass." Karen glared, as if Elaine's intervention was the betrayal of the century. "We can't just bend rules for every person who moves in. First, it's a service dog. Next, it's a menagerie of giant mutts." She shook her finger in the air. "I have a responsibility to maintain standards." Tension hung heavy in the air, but Colin simply murmured, "I'll use the dog path next time," though his clenched jaw told a different story. Elaine could see the frustration building. That evening she found a note slipped under her door. It was from Colin, thanking her for speaking up and also confessing that this harassment was starting to affect him. "I'm not going anywhere," the note said, "but it's a strain on my mental health." Elaine felt a pang of concern. Right around then, stories began circulating of Karen's latest plan. She was requesting an emergency HOA meeting to revise the association bylaws. She wanted a ban on large dogs, service dogs included, unless they complied with stricter requirements, like wearing a muzzle in common areas, or only using designated relief zones. Technically, such rules would contradict federal laws protecting service animals, but Karen seemed emboldened. Days later, as the meeting date loomed, Elaine spotted Karen fiddling with something by Colin's trash bins, late at night. Part of her wanted to call out, but she stayed quiet, uncertain. Could Karen be planting some kind of evidence? It sounded paranoid, but her gut told her something was off. Sure enough, next morning, Karen claimed she found scattered garbage that must have been rummaged by a dog. She reported it to the HOA board as a health and safety concern. Naturally, Trixie was the prime suspect, even though no one had actually seen her rummage through trash. Colin was baffled. Trixie never left his side, and she was trained not to scavenge. Elaine suspected Karen of setting a trap, but she had no proof. Meanwhile, it gave Karen more ammo for her vendetta. For Colin, each new accusation chipped away at his calm. Elaine could see the guilt in his eyes every time he had to defend Trixie, as though her very presence was a problem. And that, Elaine thought, might be exactly what Karen wanted, to wear him down, to make him feel unwelcome until he either rehomed the dog or moved. But would Karen stoop so low as to fabricate reasons to push him out? For someone who once scribbled sidewalk chalk all over her own property just to claim teen vandalism, Elaine suspected the answer was yes. And the worst part was, no one could predict how far she would go. With the HOA meeting looming, Karen's plot to strengthen her no large dogs crusade grows bolder, leaving Elaine wondering if she, and the rest of the neighbors, can intervene before it's too late. As the day of the emergency HOA meeting approached, subtle alliances began forming around the neighborhood. Despite Karen's intimidation tactics, a handful of residents reached out to Colin privately. Some shared cookies, others offered legal tips, and a few even volunteered to speak on his behalf, citing federal protections for service animals. It seemed Karen's iron rule was cracking under moral pressure. Elaine was among those quietly mobilizing support. She printed out copies of the Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines regarding service animals, highlighting the lines that made Karen's proposed restrictions outright illegal. She even encouraged neighbors who had once been silent to attend the meeting and share their views. But no matter how many times Elaine reminded herself, Karen can't win. The law's on Colin's side. She still felt a knot of dread. Karen was cunning, and she'd manipulated neighbors before. She knew how to sow seeds of fear, warning about dog bites or how just one exception could lead to all kinds of unruly pets. And for some people, the slightest whiff of unpredictability was enough to make them side with Karen, if only to preserve their sense of security. On the morning of the meeting, Colin knocked on Elaine's door. He looked exhausted, as though he hadn't slept. Trixie leaned gently against his leg for support. "Elaine," he began, voice shaky, "I don't want to impose, but if you don't mind, could you come with me tonight? You've been so supportive. It would help to have a friendly face." She smiled warmly. "Of course, Colin. We'll get through this together." That afternoon, Elaine busied herself with chores, anything to keep her mind from imagining worst-case scenarios. But around 4 p.m., a knock on her door startled her. She opened it to see Karen Monroe, standing with her stiff posture and a forced, neighborly smile. "Oh, Karen," Elaine said, trying to mask her surprise. "Elaine, may I come in?" Karen didn't wait for an answer, stepping into the living room. "I'd like to talk about the meeting tonight. As you're one of our longest tenured residents, your stance holds considerable weight." Elaine tried to maintain politeness. "Of course. Can I get you some iced tea?" Karen declined with a curt shake of her head. "I'll be brief. I've noticed your sympathetic attitude toward Colin and his dog. While I understand you want to be neighborly, you should consider the bigger picture. Some community members have already expressed concern about safety. Large dogs can be unpredictable, Elaine." "I understand concerns," Elaine said carefully, "but Trixie is a well-trained service animal. That's different from a random pet." Karen's smile tightened. "That's debatable. And you know how the guidelines read. If we allow one large dog, others will come. And not all of them will be so quiet. If you speak in favor of Colin's dog, we might end up with an influx of bigger breeds. She paused, letting the implied threat linger. Elaine felt her heart pound. She recognized this tactic. Karen was trying to guilt or scare her into withdrawing her support. Karen, let's not forget federal laws. You think the law will come swooping in to change HOA bylaws? That's a messy, lengthy process, Elaine. Karen stepped closer. But let's not be adversaries. We can preserve the harmony of Pinevale if you do the right thing. Your siding might need repainting soon, yes? And your flower beds. Well, we should recheck the HOA guidelines to see if that variety of rose is recommended. Elaine clenched her jaw at the blatant intimidation. I appreciate your concern. However, I'm standing by Colin on this. I'm sorry. Karen sniffed dismissively, turning on her heel. Don't say I didn't warn you. See you at the meeting. Once the door closed, Elaine sank onto her sofa, shaken. Karen was proving again how personal she could make this. But Elaine refused to be bullied. She felt a steely resolve sharpen. That evening, the HOA meeting took place in the clubhouse near the neighborhood's entrance. Usually these meetings attracted a modest crowd, but tonight seats were filled. Karen sat at the head table, flanked by board members who mostly looked uneasy. Colin, cane in hand, stood near the front with Trixie. Elaine slipped in beside him, offering a supportive nod. Karen opened with a routine statement about the agenda. Then she launched into a monologue on protecting the interests of Pinevale. We propose to limit dogs above 40 pounds, require muzzles in shared spaces, and restrict them to designated areas, she said smoothly, ignoring the tension in the air. A murmur of protest rose. Elaine stood. I believe that conflicts with the Americans with Disabilities Act, she said clearly, eyes sweeping the room. Yes, Colin added. Trixie is a service animal trained to assist me, and it's actually illegal to demand muzzle requirements for a service dog without evidence the dog is a direct threat. Trixie has never harmed anyone. Karen let out a tight laugh. Illegal? This is about community standards. It's not about denying your dog, just controlling it. Service dogs are not controlled by muzzle mandates, one of the neighbors spoke up. Karen, you might want to consult an attorney before this fiasco continues. The tension was palpable. Yet, despite these voices, a handful of residents seemed unsure or even fearful. Karen looked satisfied, as if all she needed was enough confusion to push her motion through. At that moment, a tall, reedy man in the back row raised his hand. I served in the army, he said. This dog is doing a service for Colin, who's also a veteran. At the word veteran, a ripple of sympathy spread through some folks. Is this how we treat neighbors who served? For a split second, Karen's composure faltered. She hadn't expected the veteran angle to come up. She cleared her throat, forcing a sympathetic expression. Of course we respect veterans, she said. But we must also respect rules. I'm only trying to ensure everyone's comfort. Colin's voice broke slightly. I rely on Trixie to help me manage my PTSD. She wakes me from night terrors. She keeps me grounded in crowded spaces, and she's no threat to anyone here. The room fell silent. Even some of Karen's usual supporters shifted uneasily. Elaine felt hope, but Karen's expression remained steely. She turned to the board, calling for an immediate vote. With the vote about to occur, Karen seems confident. Will the residents stand up to her, or will fear and confusion sway them to approve these draconian measures against Trixie and Colin? That's not true, Colin protested. I was walking Trixie, heard a noise, and came to see what was wrong. She never touched these plants. This happened before we even got here. Elaine tried to calm the crowd. Let's not jump to conclusions. She scanned the scene and noticed something odd. The fertilizer bag was ripped, but the tear looked like it was cut with a knife, not shredded by animal teeth. She bent down, lightly touching the bag's edges. No jagged tears. It was suspiciously clean. Karen folded her arms, triumphant. I told you that dog was a menace. Now we have proof." She eyed the neighbors, waiting for them to concur. Yet many seemed uncertain, glancing at Trixie, who stood quietly by Colin's side. No muddy paws, no bits of plant clinging to her fur. She didn't even look excited or guilty. She was calm, tail wagging softly. "There's no sign Trixie was digging," Elaine said, pushing forward. "And if she did, wouldn't there be dirt on her face? Or paws?" Karen's mouth twitched. "Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it didn't happen. I found them here, didn't I?" A voice behind them spoke up. It was Marty, a retiree who often walked his own dog late at night. He held up his phone, smirking. "Well, I was recording the garden from across the street a few minutes ago. See, I've been worried about raccoons getting in. My phone might have captured something interesting." Everyone leaned in. The video showed Karen quietly upending a planter herself, scattering soil with gloved hands. She then arranged some of the plants as if they'd been trampled. The crowd gasped. Karen's face turned ghostly, pale. She sputtered, I was trying to fix damage done by Trixie," but the video left no doubt. Karen had orchestrated the chaos. The final seconds showed Colin approaching with Trixie, looking alarmed. A stunned silence followed. Then, in one breath, all the pent-up tension of the neighborhood erupted into an outcry. Folks demanded Karen explain herself, questioned her fitness as HOA president, threatened to involve law enforcement. Karen stepped back, her face contorting between panic and fury. "I did this for the good of the community," she hissed. "Nobody listens to me anymore. You'll all regret letting these big dogs run wild." Marty lowered his phone. "Actually, Karen, the only person running wild is you." The crowd parted as Karen, flustered and outnumbered, hurried away into the night. Some neighbors later claimed she packed a suitcase and stayed with her sister out of town for a few weeks. Whatever the case, her campaign against Colin and Trixie collapsed. Within days, a meeting was called to remove Karen from her HOA presidency due to misconduct. The board, embarrassed by her actions, revoked her authority to issue citations or fines. Meanwhile, Colin continued to walk Trixie peacefully, garnering supportive waves from neighbors. Elaine found herself, at last, sitting on her porch in the late summer sun, watching Colin and Trixie stroll by. She couldn't help but smile at how the neighborhood had rallied around them in the end. Though some hearts still needed time to truly soften, the power of truth, and a bit of evidence caught on camera, had transformed Pine Vale's oppressive atmosphere. Without Karen's tyranny, the place felt lighter. A month later, a new HOA president was elected, someone with a more balanced approach to rules. Karen's name was still occasionally whispered, but mostly as a cautionary tale of what happens when one person's need for control drives them to desperate extremes. In time, the incident became a neighborhood legend. The fiasco of the service dog scapegoat. And Trixie? She remained the quiet, steady presence that helped Colin heal, becoming something of a local mascot for patience and resilience. And now that you've reached the end of our story, what do you think? In times of conflict, how far would you go to protect what's right, even if it means standing against an entire system? If you found this story eye-opening, share it with someone who could use a reminder that standing up for each other can break even the strongest chain of fear and intimidation. Sometimes all it takes is one person and a good dog to inspire a community to do better. Search. The moment Karen called for a vote, the entire clubhouse collectively held its breath. Would the neighborhood bow to her intimidation or rise above it? Hands began tentatively to lift in response to Karen's motion. A ban on large dogs, unless strictly muzzled and confined to designated areas. Elaine felt a sickening drop in her stomach as she watched a few neighbors raise their hands, looking almost apologetic. But then, others began to stand. "I'm voting no," declared Mrs. Perry from Pinevale's oldest corner lot. She held up a pamphlet from the ADA. Karen, you can't just ignore federal law. I've done my reading, and I won't be part of something that's both heartless and illegal. More residents rose, murmuring agreement. Voices from the back corner chimed in, some referencing personal experiences with service animals, others calling out the moral injustice. With every new "no," Karen's expression darkened. Still, a chunk of the audience looked torn, eyes flicking between Karen's imposing figure and Colin's earnest face. Karen seized her moment, raising her voice. "All right, enough. It's time for an official count." She gestured to a board member. "We need the final tally." The board member, a soft-spoken woman named Fiona, cleared her throat. "All in favor of the new measure?" she asked, scanning the room. A small group raised their hands, maybe 10 or so. All opposed? A larger group, albeit not everyone. The tension was thick. Fiona hesitated. "It seems the motion fails to pass," she said quietly. Karen's eyes flickered. She tried to mask her rage with a taut smile. "Motion fails," she said, her voice strained. "However, we will revisit guidelines in future sessions." Without waiting, she adjourned the meeting, practically storming out. A few neighbors patted Colin on the back, reassuring him. Elaine let out a relieved breath, thankful the immediate threat was over. But as she left the clubhouse, she spotted Karen near the door, whispering something to a middle-aged couple who nodded in agreement. A new plan might already be brewing. Over the next few days, though, a strange hush fell over the neighborhood. Karen's usual scrutiny seemed to pause. No new letters were taped to Colin's door. She didn't make any fuss about Trixie's daily walks. Some thought she'd finally accepted defeat, but Elaine suspected otherwise. Karen was just lying low, waiting. Meanwhile, Colin settled into a calmer routine. He even joined Elaine for a cup of iced tea on her porch one afternoon, discussing everything from his military background to future job prospects. He was warming to life in Pinevale, making quiet friendships with neighbors. Then, one late evening, an uproar broke out near the community garden. Elaine hurried outside to see lights flicking on up and down the street. Over near the raised garden beds, a group of neighbors gathered, evidently drawn by the same commotion. Karen was standing in the center of the ruckus, flanked by 2 or 3 flustered residents. At her feet lay a mess of upturned plants, broken stakes, scattered fertilizer bags. And behind her, looking equally shocked, was Colin, holding Trixie's leash. "There he is!" Karen cried, pointing a trembling finger. "I caught him letting that dog tear through our community garden." "That's not true," Colin protested. "I was walking Trixie, heard a noise, and came to see what was wrong. She never touched these plants. This happened before we even got here."